It is not Putin who oppresses ordinary Russians. Putin is the flesh and blood of the Russian people. He reflects their aspirations and desires. We must realize that Ukraine, independent Ukraine, is an existential challenge for any Russian politician regardless of his political beliefs. Therefore, we must clearly understand that any good Russians will always pursue their own national interests. And there is not always a place for Ukrainians in them.
Hello and welcome to Ukraine in Flames, a special project by Ukraine Media Center, an NGO Euro-Atlantic course, and I'm your host, Miroslava Yaremkiev. By insidiously launching a genocidal war against Ukraine, Putin and his Kremlin gang have finally established Russia's status as an enemy of humanity. We hope that the International Criminal Court's warrant for Putin's arrest is only the beginning of worldwide legal and political recognition of this status. However, it would be dangerously naive to blame only the head of the Russian half-empire and his closest entourage for all the horrors of this war. Crimes against humanity and genocide against the people of Ukraine are committed by thousands of ordinary Russians. They have come to our land to kill, torture, rape, and steal. Russians bring death to all living things, not only to people, but also to animals and nature in general. In today's episode, we're going to talk about good Russians. Do they exist? How can they become allies for Ukrainians? And can we rely on their support in dismantling the war-mongering Russian Federation? If you want to learn more about this subject, please continue watching this video and subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss our videos in the future. It is easy to explain Russia's aggression against Ukraine as the ambitions of one evil person, but that is too simple. In this case, evil does not spread from top to bottom, but vice versa. The Russian state made a collective decision to start a war, and people capable of critical analysis understand that this war is not only waged against Ukraine. It takes a strong leader to manage something of this magnitude, and you can't create a strong leader without the support of the vast majority of the population. According to polls, the majority of Russians continue to express support for the actions of their country's armed forces in Ukraine. In January 2024, 77% of respondents supported the Russian army, while 86% approved of Putin's activities. For comparison, 86% of Russians represent about 120 million people, which is equivalent to the population of 20 countries like Denmark, 3 countries like Canada, or 2 like Italy. More on that, please welcome Director of the NGO Euro-Atlantic course, Igor Seletskyi.
Obviously, the topic of our today's issue is caused, among other things, by the press conference of Russian political prisoners who were released as a result of a big exchange. But in general, the topic is very important, first of all, for Western society to understand. For Ukrainians, everything is more or less obvious. Returning to the topic of the press conference, it answered the questions of this issue in many ways. Look, people were exchanged for spies and killers. They were released from Russian prisons where people are tortured and killed. We know this from the example of Alexei Navalny and the examples of many others, including Ukrainian prisoners of war. And what do these people say at the press conference? At the beginning, they say, "Why did you release us? We didn't ask for this. We were kicked out of Russia. We didn't want this release." Obviously, saying this, they simply cast doubt on further exchanges of this kind. Why? Because, in fact, the release of the killer Krasikov, FSB agent Krasikov, from the German prison caused a significant split in the German elite and German society. Many were against this release, including the prosecutor general, the Minister of Justice, and other politicians in both the ruling parties and the opposition. They don't say a word. They hardly mention the Russian Ukrainian war or other people who are in prisons, who are being tortured and killed. They don't say a word about the need to release them. They say they'll fight exclusively for political prisoners, although in reality, tens of thousands of Ukrainian prisoners of war suffer from terrible torture in Russian prisons. Instead, they say lift the sanctions against ordinary Russians. Ordinary Russians aren't to blame. Are ordinary Russians to blame? My answer is definitely yes. It is ordinary Russians who support the war. 80% of Russian citizens support the war. It is ordinary Russians who elected Putin. Even if the elections were absolutely fair, with real candidates, Putin would still be elected president of the Russian Federation. This must be understood. It is not Putin who oppresses ordinary Russians. Putin is the flesh and blood of the Russian people. He reflects their aspirations and desires. So, of course, we can't separate ordinary Russians from Putin. That's about the general public. As for the so-called good Russians, including those political prisoners who were released as part of the big exchange, Lenin, and I hope we all know who Lenin is, said that a Russian democrat ends where the national question begins. And it's absolutely true. If we take big Russian liberals, starting with them and ending with Khodorkovsky and others, with very rare exceptions, they are imperialists, just like Putin and his entourage. I'm deeply convinced that reforms in Russia should not begin with democratization, not with all those correct things that exist in the West. It was already in the 1990s. Reforms in Russia must begin with the deimperialization of Russia itself, not even its foreign policy. There must be no dominant nation in the Russian Federation. The dominant nation now is Russian, it is obvious, and all other nations are oppressed. All other nations are led to slaughter in the Russian-Ukrainian war. Statistics show that most of the mobilized and contracted soldiers are from the national republics. National languages, national customs, and national traditions are suppressed there. Russia must be de-imperialized. Good Russians are imperialists like Putin and his entourage. Therefore, there are no good Russians in the national question and in the question of de-imperialization of Russia.
At the beginning of the war, Ukrainians were more optimistic. We believed that the Russians would finally wake up, take a chance, overthrow the government, end the war, and build a normal democratic society. But we miscalculated because we evaluated them based on the subjective experiences of the Orange Revolution and the Revolution of Dignity. The Russians did not have similar protests, and the rallies on Bolotnaya Square cannot even be closely compared to our Maidans. Ukrainians simply do not understand the Russians and their bottomless patience for the deterioration of the situation. Ukrainians don't understand how one can silently film on a smartphone while policemen are beating protesters next to them. And they're unlikely to even understand. We are different, and even such a banal example destroys the myth of a one nation. Yevhen Mahda, director of the Institute of World Politics, will elaborate more on this.
I think that the behavior of Russia's citizens who, on August the 1st, found themselves on the territory of the United States and Germany as a result of prisoner exchange between Russia and the West proved to all of us that good Russians simply do not exist in nature. They turned out to be so shallow compared, for example, to the late Boris Nemtsov, that thinking about how they can maneuver and how they can act is simply not worth wasting time on. The problem is that Russian liberalism has been ending on the Ukrainian issue for more than a century, and there are no changes taking place in this sense. And I think there will not be any changes in principle. We must realize that Ukraine, independent Ukraine, is an existential challenge for any Russian politician, regardless of his political beliefs. That is why we must clearly understand that those Russians who are fighting against the Putin regime with weapons in their hands can be our allies, whereas all others, they are the ones who have to prove with concrete, substantive actions that they can be our allies. Otherwise, it does not work and will not work. We must learn from our own mistakes. That is why we should not tolerate Russian oppositionists gatherings on the territory of the Lviv region. That is why we should not invite Russian-speaking speakers to participate in broadcasts on the Russian language state TV channel called Freedom. That's why we should not play along with those who will call us Khachli tomorrow. We should not do this, because the Ukrainians are currently waging a war for independence and trying to take revenge in the traditional and long-lasting confrontation with the Russian Empire, which has stopped pretending to be democratic, federal, etc. It is our enemy, and Russian citizens in their mass are our enemies too.
Actually, Ukrainians use the expression good Russians in quotation marks. They may be against Putin and the war, but not to the extent of helping Ukrainians destroy the occupiers or wishing for the collapse of the new Russian Empire, decolonization, and freedom for the peoples enslaved by the Russian government. They prefer to live in democratic European countries, but often do not want democracy at home because they fear chaos and revolution. Despite government controls and numerous restrictions, Russians are not completely isolated. They can conduct their own research and access the same information sources as the rest of the world. These facts reveal a harsh reality that many refuse to acknowledge. For 120 million Russians, support for aggression may indeed be a conscious decision, made not only under the influence of propaganda, but despite the open sources of information available to them. Why then do we choose to see the bright side, no matter how dark it may be? Expert on international politics Igor Stokoz will try to answer that.
Why should we not expect support from the good Russians? It has long been said that every Russian social democrat ends where the Ukrainian question begins. This is the first. Second, for some reason, Ukrainians hope for the Russians who in their heads are trying to be good Russians. In their heads are trying to build a beautiful Russia of the future, and still somehow do not leave room for Ukraine. And it is clear why. First of all, these good Russians, and some of them are Russian politicians, and they broadcast to their internal audience the messages that should get through to their voters. The Ukrainian issue has always been a trigger for Russian society. We all understand very well that it was precisely in those ancient historical times that Ukrainians participated in the development of the Russian state. In particular, in recent times, examples can be given that practically the entire gas industry, coal industry, and mining industry were all developed by the hands of Ukrainians. This is the Usinsk Basin in the Republic of Komi. These are the oil and gas fields in the Khanty-Mansiysk National District. These are gas and oil fields in Siberia. Therefore, we must clearly understand that any good Russians will always pursue their own national interests. And there is not always a place for Ukrainians in them. And they understand very well that Russia is a European state until the Russian Federation includes a European component in the form of Ukraine. Therefore, we must understand one thing, that we should not count on the support of the Russian opposition. I do believe that they should not be neglected, that is, they can be used to ensure Ukrainian interests. But counting on the fact that they will recklessly defend Ukrainian interests, this will never happen. And there are enough examples of this. The recent press conference, the first press conference held in Germany, with the participation of released Yashin, Kramurza, and others, was very disturbing for Ukrainians. They said exactly what they wanted to say. Therefore, we should take this into account and build our strategy and our relations with such an opposition based solely on Ukrainian interests.
You've been watching a special project by Ukraine Media Center and Euro-Atlantic course dedicated to the Russian-Ukrainian war, Ukraine in Flames. In the description under this video, you can find information on how you can help Ukraine fight Russian aggression. If you find our work useful, please like and share this video. Slava Ukraini!